we're continuing to implement the deal. I'd refer you to Treasury for details on this particular these particular licenses, and it's really for Treasury to speak to, but it's very much in keeping with our commitment to meeting our obligations under the JCPOA. And I think my colleague at the White House addressed this a little bit today, in reinforcing the fact that these are decisions that have been weeks, if not months, in the making, and been working through the normal process of implementation.
Is it their concern that the next administration, the president-elect has threatened to tear up the JCPOA? Is there a concern in this in this building that these decisions could be reversed?
Well, again, I can't and won't speculate about what the next administration will do with respect to the Iran deal. All I can reinforce is what we have done and will do, and we're going to continue to meet our obligations. These licenses that we're talking about are part and parcel of that effort. We still believe very, very strongly that the Iran deal is good, not just for our friends and partners in the region, but for the world, and certainly are very much in keeping with our own national security interests. And as the Secretary has said many times, an Iran without nuclear weapons capabilities only helps reduce the other problems that we have to deal with in the Middle East. They haven't gone away. Iran's destabilizing activity is still a major issue of concern for us, but removing their ability to obtain nuclear weapons capability certainly makes those other problems a little bit easier to deal with, not completely. So we obviously continue to strongly support the Iran deal. We will continue to implement it appropriately as we are required to under the JCPOA. Whatever decisions the next administration makes is obviously, it's for them to speak to.
But it must sit uneasily in this building that these kinds of things could be reversed. I mean, some would believe that this is being done now so that so that these decisions aren't left until after January 20th.
Yeah, look, I've heard talk about that and speculation about that. I absolutely can fundamentally assure you that we're doing nothing other than meeting our obligations and our commitments, and the kinds of things that we're doing, such as the licenses that we're talking about today, have been weeks, if not months, in the planning. I mean, this isn't the kind of thing you throw on like a light switch. It takes time and planning to do it, and the Treasury Department, again, without speaking for them, have been working on this very, very hard. There's no final push. There's no sort of concerted effort here to sort of make things, irretrievably, complete. It is about meeting our obligations. And I think it is important, again, without speaking to what the next administration might or might not do, it's important to remember that this isn't a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran. It is a multilateral international agreement, and that character of it, the truly international scope of it, I think needs to be taken into account. But again, we continue to firmly believe in the soundness of this deal, in the security that gives our friends and partners in the region, as well as the American people.
So, just explain to me what this obligation is. You're obliged to license requests for commercial aircraft sales to Iran?
It is. When I talked about obligations, Brad, I was talking about, broadly speaking, our obligations to meet our commitments under the deal. But as you know, the deal did call for the lifting of some sanctions, and it did allow for the resumptions of some licensing, particularly with civil aviation, and that's what this is regarding to.
Well, why is it such a complicated, many-month process if it's an obligation?
Just because something is a commitment or an obligation doesn't mean it's easy to do right away. And again, I can't speak to the process here. I just know that the Treasury Department has been working on this for some time. There had been previous licenses issued. I think we've talked about that. I don't know I'm not an expert on the licensing process, again, I'd refer you to Treasury, but the larger point I'm making is that this decision, the one we're talking about today, had nothing to do, and the timing was not at all related to our own presidential election.
But you saw the letter from Speaker Ryan, I'm guessing, about
yes,
asking.
I have.
Do you feel that the lame duck period is appropriate for introducing or taking decisions that fundamentally alter the situation regarding investment and business in Iran?
Sure, fair question. So we have seen the letter. I won't speak for the White House because the letter was addressed to the president. Obviously, I'm quite certain that the letter will be responded to appropriately by our colleagues at the White House. And the second point I make is we will, as we have, continue to have an ongoing dialogue and communication with members of Congress about implementation of how long and what it takes to get this thing granted. But the point is, it's nothing new.
No, I understand.
And look, we have seen the Speaker's letter. We're aware of the Speaker's concerns, and I'm sure that our colleagues at the White House will respond appropriately.
I understand the deal it was first announced in January, so it'd be silly to argue that this is a new process that just started after the election.
Machiavellian intent here to sort of to push in any way outside the bounds of our normal commitments and obligations here in the final months of the administration. What we are committed to doing is meeting our obligations in a consistent, forthright manner, and this license that we're talking about today is one of those obligations.
Syria?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, there was a call between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov today.
Yes, there was.
Okay, could you give us a read?
So, there was a conversation today over the phone with Foreign Minister Lavrov. Obviously, Syria was the main topic of discussion, and the Secretary and the Foreign Minister talked about the importance of continuing to work towards a cessation of hostilities, in trying to find ways to get that cessation of hostilities in a place where it can lead to a resumption of political talks, and to try to build a framework that can make sense for that cessation of hostilities to actually work. And obviously this conversation, as previous ones, have been done in the context of the continued bombing and bloodshed in Aleppo, and the urgency that the Secretary feels to try to get the cessation of hostilities in place as soon as possible.
And according to the Foreign Ministry in Russia, the Russian Foreign Ministry, forgive me, they also say that the Secretary and the Foreign Minister discussed getting eastern Aleppo back to normal conditions, I guess, without, let's say, the militants like Jabhat al-Nusra and others. Could you explain that? Because I did not understand what they were saying, but they're saying they discussed getting Aleppo back to normal.
Well, look, I would let the Russians characterize what they mean by normal, or normalization is, I think, the word that I saw phrased in their readout. They can speak for what they think that means. What I can tell you is, on our side, and I've spoken to the Secretary since the call, what the Secretary was interested in pursuing was ways to stop the bloodshed in Aleppo, and that they focus very much on that, and on getting a cessation of hostilities that can be maintained and sustained, not just in Aleppo but elsewhere throughout the country, so that political talks can resume. Now, clearly, they talked about the continuing threat that's posed by al-Nusra, and as they have almost every time they've talked about, certainly the situation in Aleppo. But what the Russian Foreign Ministry described as normalization, I think I'd let them describe what we would like to see. I won't slap the label normalization on it, but what we would like to see is for the violence to stop, for the bombing to stop, for the shelling to stop, for the humanitarian aid to get in so that people can live a safe, secure life, and that Aleppo can get back to a sense of calm and peace. And as you look at the images coming out of there today, I mean, you can see that there's a long way to go.
Now, going back to the UN Security Council meeting yesterday, the American ambassador, Samantha Power, she cited a source who said that there was 180 air raids conducted by the Syrians and the Russians, and she cited one source, to which obviously the Syrian representative says, how could you possibly be so sure of 180 raids? So I must ask this question again. I know I asked it yesterday. What other sources do you have other than someone, let's say, who might be in Eastern Aleppo, who might represent the opposition, who might have, their own agenda and so on? How do you...
Well, look, I mean,
how do you
Ambassador Power
veracity?
did cite her source, and she cited it as a source.
Right.
She didn't claim that the information for herself. She cited the source. And it was an example of the continued airstrikes that we see in and around Aleppo. And then she went on, of course, to talk about the atrocities and those that we believe need to be held accountable for that. But look, Saeed, I don't have a different answer for you today than I did yesterday. We look, while I said yesterday, knowledge is imperfect. Of course it is. And I've said that from the get-go. But it doesn't mean that we can't, through stitching together various sources of information, get a pretty good sense, pretty good mosaic of the information that's coming in. So yes, it comes from some credible aid agencies like the World Health Organization, like Doctors Without Borders, like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. It comes from individuals that were in But it's certainly strong enough and convincing enough to tell us that bombs continue to drop on innocent civilians in Syria, that hospitals, now according to various sources, there are no working hospitals in Aleppo, and so people have nowhere to go for the medical treatment that they're so desperately in need of as the bombs continue to rain down on top of them. That's what we need to focus on, and that's why
of names as, the committee having committed war crimes and so on. They're all in the Syrian army. Surely you don't disagree that there are also war crimes committed by the opposition, right?
Look, I'm not going to. I'm not going to.
There were names.
Saeed, I'm not going to elaborate.
From the Syrian army, but we did not see or hear any names from the opposition that may have committed war crimes and targeted civilians.
The purpose of, I'm not going to elaborate more on what the ambassador had to say yesterday. The purpose was to lay bare the information that we have with respect to violations by and atrocities committed by Syrian officials and Syrian military units. And I'm not going to get into another debate here with you or anybody else about the definition of war crimes. The Secretary has talked about the fact that we believe that war crimes should be investigated. Ambassador Power has talked about that. She laid out some of that case yesterday, I think, very not allowing humanitarian aid. We've been very quick to bring the issue to their attention and to express our deep concern over that. But without question, Saeed, back to the conversation we were having about a mosaic of information. Without question, this mosaic of information and the information that we continue to glean civilians, of destruction of innocent property and infrastructure, and the obstruction of humanitarian aid getting to desperate people are caused by the Syrian regime and their Russian backers. Period. It's not in dispute. Yeah.
Yeah.
To continue on Syria, Russian media quote their deputy foreign minister as saying that Syria's Kurds need to be included in any resumption of the political talks in Syria.
Yeah.
Quote, Kurds should be included in the negotiating process. Kurds are a real military and political force having control of a considerable part of Syrian territory, which actively participate in the fight against terrorism. What is your view on that?
Well, our view hasn't changed on that. I think we've talked about this before, first, we realize that Kurdish forces have fought bravely against Daesh in Iraq and in Syria, no question about that. And the support that they predominantly get, at least mostly in Syria, is through coalition air power. And where we can support competent, effective fighters on the ground, we're going to continue to do that. As for the political process, we continue to support, as does every other member of the ISSG, at least those who signed the communiques, and that would include Russia, on paper anyway, support a UN-led process by which the opposition and the regime can begin to have political discussions about a negotiated solution. Now, obviously, we haven't had those discussions in quite some time because the bombs keep dropping on innocent people. But that's where we want to get to. We want it to be UN-led, which means that the special envoy, Mr. de Mistura, will decide in concert with talking to the opposition and the regime about composition at the table. Now, on the opposition side, that has been largely a function of the HNC, the High Negotiating Committee, which we continue to support and endorse. And as of the last time that they talked, it was the special envoy's view that while there were Kurdish representatives kept informed, but that we weren't at the point where he believed they needed to be represented at the table. Now, look, that was months ago. And we can't even, so it's interesting to have this nice little academic argument about who's at the table. We would love to be able to get to the point where we can actually sit down and have a conversation about the table. Right now, you can't do that because there's no working hospitals in Aleppo. There's been no aid that's gotten in more than a month, and people continue to die. So while it would be entertaining to have an academic debate about this, what we're focused on, what the Secretary's focused on, is on getting a cessation of hostilities that can get us to a point where we can have political talks. And then when we get there, if we can get there, then we can have this, we can have another discussion about who is represented. But so far, in the 2 rounds we've had, it was the special envoy's view that while the Kurdish representatives we kept informed, and he did that religiously, he did a very good job with that, it was not his view that we were at the point where they should be necessarily an active part of the proximity talks.
So if we were to get to the point where there was discussion at a table, you would be open to the idea that there should be more Kurdish involvement than there has been so far?
What we would be open to is the special envoy having a discussion with the HNC and the regime about who would be represented. And believe me, that is a conversation we would love to be able to have today, but we can't because of what's happening in Aleppo.
I can understand. I have a second question.